G'day people and welcome. I'm Sharon. Thank you to my friend Kathryn who has loaned me her Janome CM17 for these tutorials. If you own a Janome CM17 and you're watching through my tutorials, the ones that I would most recommend to you are this one on settings, the one on edit screens, which is upcoming, and the one I've already done on the ready to sew screen. That's because they're the places where you control the machine. After that, maybe look at the lettering ones. The machine is currently in regular sewing mode, doing straight stitch and those sorts of things. But you'll notice that there are not very many stitches showing. And that is because the machine knows I've got the foot plate on, or the needle plate on, for embroidery. And it can't do most of its stitches while it's got that needle plate on. So it very definitely on its own, without me doing anything about it, will not let me try and do a zigzag. It's the wrong foot plate for doing a zigzag. We're going to look at settings, and settings are down here. It's the cog. So we're going in there, and you'll notice we've actually got several things across the top here. The reason I'm not going to show you about the Wi-Fi, it's because it's not my machine and I'm not connected up to it, so I'm going to leave that. There are plenty of places around that you can find out more about connecting your machine to the Wi-Fi. The other areas we have here, this is combined sewing. So these, when we touch the settings in this area, they're going to affect both embroidery and regular sewing. These ones are for only using when you're doing regular sewing. So the feed dogs are up and the machine's working like a normal sewing machine. These ones are only operational when you're doing embroidery. So we've got a picture of an embroidery hoop. We're not going to worry about the Wi-Fi. And over here we've got the flags. You can choose the language that you want your machine to talk to you in. And if your grandchild or somebody has very helpfully put your machine into a different language, this is where you go to put it back into the English or whatever it is that you want it to be in. I'm going to start in the combined settings. The first thing we're given the option to change is the volume of the sound. And we can go up, or we can turn it off. As a rule, I wouldn't recommend that you turn the sound off on your machine for a few reasons. The first one is that it's very possible to touch buttons and not realise that you've done something if you've got the sound off. By having the sound on, you can at least hear it going bonk, 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 and know that it's doing something, even if you're not quite sure what it's doing. The only time I really turn the sound off on my machines is if I'm at a retreat or something like that, and mine's the only one that's making those kinds of noises, and I don't want to annoy other people. Otherwise, leave the sound on. You can regret not having it on. Screen brightness is going to make my screen brighter and brighter and dimmer and dimmer. Set the brightness of your screen to whatever is comfortable for you, and it will depend on how bright the room is, or perhaps how good your eyes are. Clock display on and off, so it's set to 12:44 p.m. here in Perth, Western Australia. You set the clock where you want it to be. Date and time setting allows you to change those things. Most of the world will want their machine in millimetres. Some of you may want it in inches. To the best of my knowledge, all of the templates all around the world are in millimetres. If you can use millimetres, please do. You'll find that everything makes a bit more sense and is probably a bit more accurate that way. And if I change anything here, I need to press OK for it to be registered. But I don't need to do that immediately. I can go through the entire lot of the settings before I actually do that. And you'll notice that there are 4 pages, and we're on page 1 of 4 of machine settings. To go over the page, we touch the arrow. There is a message that you can have turned on that will tell you every 10 hours to clean your bobbin holder. it's worth having that on to remind you to get in there and get the dirt out. Standby timer, this is how long the screen is going to stay active before it goes to sleep. The machine won't be turned off, but the screen gets turned off, so it gives the screen a bit of a break. You can have a screensaver on your machine. It comes with one. You can either have that turned on or off. If it's turned off, then when the standby timer goes off, things should go to a blank screen. If you've put a screensaver in there, then when the standby timer happens, then you should go to that screensaver. Import and delete will allow you to bring in a photograph to use as your screensaver, so you don't have to have the one that's built into the machine. Auto off time setting is how long the machine will stay on before it turns itself off. So 10 minutes, the screen's going to go blank or go to your screensaver. In this case, it's 7 hours. The whole machine is just going to turn itself off. It will consider that you've gone somewhere else and turn itself off. We'll go over the page. Sewing lights. I've currently got the sewing lights off on the machine, and I usually try to film with them off because they tend to make things strobe a bit. If I turn them on now, I hope we don't get too much strobing. You can see how bright they are, but I do have the option to make that level of brightness a bit dimmer so it's not quite as offensive. Sometimes it can be overwhelming how bright these machines are. I am actually going to turn the lights off again. Needle plate lifter time setting. I have actually changed the needle plate in the threading video, and 4 seconds is how long the machine will hold the plate up before it reconnects it. So if you want to give yourself more time to pick the plate up and get it out, then this is the place to extend that time. If you want it to be less, it will take it down to 2 seconds, and you'll have to be a lot quicker getting your plate out. Bobbin winding speed. The speed Kathryn's got her machine set at is 5. Almost certainly that 5 setting will be fine. However, be aware. I have seen machines where somebody has wound their bobbin very quickly with a stretchy thread. Then when they went to get the bobbin off the spindle, it wouldn't come off. Why? Because that stretchy thread has pulled on the bobbin in the middle, and it's now holding on so tight to the spindle that it won't come off. So just be aware. The only way to get it off is actually to unwind the bobbin, and that's not a lot of fun when it's stuck to a spindle. Page 4 of machine settings. This gives me an opportunity to format the machine, which is basically like doing a defrag on a computer. You can also format your USBs here, and that puts the appropriate folders onto the USB that your machine expects to see. It's a pretty slow way to do it, but you can certainly do it here. I can reset everything to defaults here, which I don't want to do because it's not my machine, it's Kathryn's machine. So I'm not going to press that. That's all of the things in the combined sewing and embroidery areas. Now we're going to look at the settings just for the sewing side of the machine. These are the beginning, page 1 of 4, of the sewing settings. So these will only do things for the side of the machine which is doing regular sewing. It's not going to have any effect whatever on the embroidery side. Thread cut after auto log. If you engage the thread cut after auto log, then when you press that little button that looks like a target and the machine does 3 or 4 stitches in one spot to lock off for you, it will then immediately do a thread cut. And that sounds like a great idea, except if you remember that you should never use the thread cutter if you are using a specialty thread. And by that I mean a thick thread or a metallic thread. In both cases, those threads will wreck your thread cutter. I personally would rather do it manually and be thinking, no, I've got a metallic thread in here, I'm not going to use that. rather than have the machine do it for me and then go, "Ah, I didn't want that to happen." Needle stop position. This is set at the moment to stop with the needle down in the fabric, which is where we want it most of the time, so that when we stop, the fabric doesn't shift around. There's a toggle key over towards where your start-stop button is, which has an arrow going up and an arrow going down. That's your needle up-down button. Use that to move the needle if it's in the down position and you want it up. Feed dogs. Right at the moment the feed dogs are set to up, which is what you would normally expect to have going on when you're sewing, because the feed dogs need to pull the fabric along. Feed dogs go down for doing free motion work. Pretty much for most people that's going to be quilting, and there are other ways to get to a really good quilt stitch for free motion in this machine. And aside from that, maybe for free motion artwork. This is probably where you would go if you're doing free motion artwork and you want to put the feed dogs down. Auto tension. The machine comes out of the factory with its tension set to what would be expected of a machine. If you are always using an odd thread that the tension is not working for, change it here in the settings. Otherwise, change it in the individual stitch when you need to. It's better to only be doing it occasionally if that's all you need, rather than doing a blanket change that you don't need all the time. And if you don't know what plus and minus does, that's a higher number and that's a lower number, and have a look at my tension video. Presser foot pressure is how hard the presser foot is pushing on your fabric. If the presser foot pressure is too high for the fabric that you're sewing on, which might be because it's on the bias or it could be because you're on a stretchy fabric, then it may press on it too hard and stretch the fabric while you're sewing, and then you end up with that lovely homemade look. In order to avoid that, you can change the presser foot pressure, release some of it. You don't want to release it too much because then the foot won't hold the fabric and you won't get nice even stitches. Foot height for pivoting. This machine has a pivot function, and that means that when you take your foot off the accelerator, the needle goes down into the fabric and then the foot comes up, and that allows you to turn where you're going, turn corners and things like that. In this position you have the ability to actually change how high the foot is going to come up when it does that pivoting. Page 2 of the sewing settings. If you are sewing with the start-stop button or the foot control, then you have the option of how quickly the machine is going to respond to what you're doing. If you set it here, the machine will start slowly and gradually build up its speed. Regardless of how hard you press on the presser foot, it will start slowly and build up. If it's in the middle, it will be more responsive more quickly, and up here it will be immediately responsive. For people who haven't sewn a lot, it may help you to be in the lower end. People who've sewn a lot over the years will probably find that will drive them bananas, and they really want it set at the high rate. Upper thread breakage sensor. There is a sensor in the machine that can tell if the thread at the top has broken. If you've got it on, it will stop. If you've got it off, it will keep sewing even though you no longer have any thread there. People often wonder why on earth you would want to sew without that on, but there are good reasons. Maybe you're sewing, preferably with a very old needle, through paper because you want to perforate it for some reason. Maybe you're doing something for a craft group or a school and you need to have perforations that you can then rip open the paper. You can't do that with thread in, you've got to have the thread out, but if you've got that sensor on, the machine's not going to actually sew without a thread. Bobbin thread remaining sensor. If you turn this on, then the machine will check every couple of times that you put your foot down whether it thinks you've got an appropriate amount of thread on the bobbin. If you turn it off, it won't check, it won't look. Over the page, page 3 of 4, variable zigzag sensitivity. This machine comes with a knee control. On most Janome machines, a knee lifter like this, when you move it across, it lifts the presser foot off your fabric. But in this particular machine, that is what the pivot function does. You don't need to use your knee for it. So what's this for? There's a function called a variable zigzag, and essentially it's for doing artwork things. When you are on the particular stitch for variable zigzag and you have this in your machine, when you move your knee across, you get a wider zigzag, and when you release it, you get a narrower zigzag. The button here in the settings will make the machine more sensitive to what your knee is doing. ASR is the machine working out how fast you're moving fabric underneath its needle. ASR sensitivity is used when you're doing free motion quilting so that the machine can work out how fast your hands are moving and how many stitches it needs to put in to keep those stitches all the same length. If you move your hands too quickly, it's going to start beeping at you, depending on whether you've got the next button on or off. Favourite stitch adjustment is sort of like allowing you to change the defaults on a stitch. Let's imagine that you're doing zigzag and you always like your zigzag to be set at 2 millimeters wide and 2 millimeters long. If you've got this on, you can change that so that every time you go to a zigzag, what comes up is what you like it to be. And here you can delete all of the favourite stitch adjustments that you've done. Resume mode allows that when the machine comes back on, after it's been turned off, if you've got this set on, it will come back to the stitch that you were doing with all of the settings and things that you had it on. If you don't have resume mode on, it will go straight back to straight stitch, whatever you were doing the last time. And that's the end of the sewing settings. And now let's have a look at the embroidery settings. So I go up here to the hoop, and there are 5 pages of embroidery settings. Auto tension, Janome has got the machine set assuming that you will be using Janome bobbin fill and their embroidery threads. If you always use a different embroidery thread or a different bobbin fill, this is the place to change it. Work out where you want it to be and change it here, and that way every single design that you go to do, the machine will go to the settings you want it at. In this area, I can change how high the foot is going to be. So if you're working on very thick things, you might want to set it higher. If you're working with a thin fabric and only tear away underneath it, you want to have the foot coming down close to the fabric. If you have it too high up, you get a thing called flagging, where the thread actually wanders around between the foot and the fabric. One stitch stop. One stitch stop is one of those things that's a bit difficult to describe. If it is off, the machine will just, when you push start for an embroidery, it will just start doing its stuff. And it tends to bury the needle thread under the design. And that's okay a lot of the time. But sometimes you really don't want it to bury that thread under there, because it ends up producing a nest on the back of your work. One stitch stop, if you've got that on, hold the needle thread when you press start stop. It will do one stitch and then stop, and you can use that thread that you're holding to pick the bobbin thread up and pull it through to the top, and then you don't get the nest underneath. Maximum speed setting. This machine can do up to 1200 stitches per minute. You'll notice there's a mark here, which is where the machine would normally be set when you get it from the factory. 600 stitches per minute. They go as low as 400. I usually don't run my machine terribly fast, but this one is set out here at the moment to 1200. You do have the option with the slider, which is to the right of the start stop button, to actually override this. If you've got it set to 1200 stitches per minute and you move your slider to the far right, you will get 1200 stitches per minute when the machine can do it on the design. If you have got this set to 400 stitches per minute, then on the far right of the slider it will do 400 stitches per minute. So you can adjust things here, and this is the far right extreme of what the machine will do. Consecutive colour groupings allows your machine to carry on if the next colour on the design is the same. It will allow you to just keep going without stopping. Over the page, upper thread breakage sensor. Most of the time you're going to want this on because you're going to want to know when the thread breaks. There are occasions, however, when you will want this off. Perhaps you are trying to just put holes into layers of tearaway in order to use them with bounce powder to put quilting designs onto something. Bobbin remaining thread sensor, this one doesn't give us any options to change it. Usually you will want it on so that you know that the machine is not going to run out of thread whilst it's in the middle of an embroidery. Thread cutting, I'm not going to go through these, they're not really necessary. If you want thread cutting on or off, this is the place to turn it on or off. Once again, if you are using metallic threads or any other sort of specialty threads, you want to turn the thread cutting off. You do not want to be using your thread cutter to cut threads that are going to damage the blade. It is possible to change some of these settings. You're probably never going to do it. Kathryn has got her machine set to Robinson & Anton thread colours. Regardless of which thread type you choose to use, you will want to try and have a thread chart for that thread. And the reason is it's hard to tell the difference between a 1022 thread and a 1135 if you're just looking at the screen on your machine. The machine doesn't give you that good of an indication of exactly what the colours look like, and you probably do not own every single Madeira thread or every single Robinson & Anton thread. So without having something that gives you an idea of relative colours, you probably are in a bit of trouble. This is a Janome thread chart from many years ago. To the best of my knowledge, they don't actually make this anymore. This one's got the actual threads on it. The one that they have now is just picture of things, of the colours. It does help to have that because it gives you the option of working out, oh, is this a dark green or a light green or an olive green that I need to find amongst my dozens of different kinds of threads. That's why I tend to keep things in the Janome range. One of the other things to remember now though is that in this particular machine there is some change to the tensions depending on what you tell it you're using. So not sure how that works when most of us would not use any one kind of thread. Most of us will be using Madeiras and Robinson & Anton and Janome and whatever else we happen to have found. Over the page, locking stitch after each colour change. Digitizers will usually put a locking stitch in at the appropriate places, and there are some places in my designs where I choose not to put them because I want you to be able to remove that stitching, and if you put a locking stitch there it's much harder for you to do. After thread trimming, it's usually on, allowing you to position the design during an embroidery. If you have had your embroidery come out of the hoop before you've finished and you've managed to get it, you think, back into the hoop in pretty close to the right spot, this may help you to get back into the design and shuffle it around a little bit to make it not too noticeable that there was a problem happened. Hoop calibration is for when your machine is telling you it's in the middle of the hoop, but the hoop center is not under the needle. Grid lines you usually want on. They, in the edit screen, match up with the lines on your templates, and it helps you to work out just how big things are and where they are going to stitch out. Grid size is set to 10 mils, and that's really great because it matches the templates that come with your hoops. Resume mode is set to on. I think we can safely say this is a long and harrowing video. If you've made it through to the end, thank you, and I hope you've learned something about your CM17. I'll see you next time.